Well, good morning, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here. My remit this morning is to say a little bit about the government role in revalidation from my perspective with Scottish Government. I think it's worth just saying at the outset that this is a reserved power with the UK Parliament, and therefore revalidation is a UK process, and the legislation is UK legislation that applies throughout the United Kingdom. But there's provision within the legislation for implementation according to the local context, although the principles must be the same across the whole country. Remediation, however, is a devolved matter. So the 4 UK departments are required. The role of the UK departments is really to implement the legislation. And the 4 departments are required to work very closely, and we've done that, and we meet regularly together and with the GMC. Almost all other health matters are devolved to the Scottish Parliament in the Scottish context. There are only 2 or 3 reserved powers, of which this is one, signing of death certificates, some forensic activities or others, but everything else, all other healthcare is dissolved to the Scottish Parliament. And Scottish Government have the role of implementing any legislation in the Scottish context. And there's a requirement for the Department of Health, who are the lead department on this legislation, to consult with Scottish ministers and with ministers in the other devolved nations. I think when asked what is the government view, the first thing you realise when you speak to government and are involved with government is they have an overall view of doctors. Doctors to government are one big group. They really don't consider to any great degree the individual subspecialties. Now, though we as surgeons consider ourselves to be preeminent among doctors, that is not the government perspective. And legislation has to apply to all doctors, and the implementation of revalidation equally has to be suitable and to work for all doctors. Now, this was some data which was obtained, commissioned by the JMC and obtained by the Peninsula University when they asked a series of stakeholders what their view of revalidation was. And this is the word matrix, which emerged from that. And you could see the enormous variation between fit to practice, governance, leadership, GMC, colleges, complex simplicity, conflict. There are whole different stakeholders have a different view of revalidation. So I guess what's government view of revalidation? I can only talk for Scottish Government, but this would, I'm sure, apply to the other governments too. We strongly support revalidation based on enhanced appraisal, and it's worth saying other information. It isn't actually just on enhanced appraisal. If a medical director has other concerns, these can be brought to the JMC, as we've just heard. Indeed, we had made a commitment to introduce enhanced appraisal even if revalidation hadn't gone ahead. We support the view that this will show that doctors are up to date and fit to practice, and actually that's what governments believe revalidation will deliver, but we want it to be proportionate yet fit for purpose. I'll say a little more about that. It must be fair and consistent in standard for doctors and for the service, and above all, governments want this to improve patient care, and they would like evidence that it improves the patient care. So it's been a tightrope between proportion and time and cost to the department, and yet we want it to be fit for purpose, as do the GMC and as does everyone else. Now, there was a time in this process 4 or 5 years ago when this looked as though it might be your revalidation. Things had run out of hand, lots and lots of things were being tagged to revalidation. There's also been a tension, I think, between the view that revalidation is about patient protection, the idea that it's standards will find a bad apple, and really the BMA view, which is that this is a reflective, soft discussion in the workplace. I think it's very clear that government would be on the side of the patient protection. They see this as a model that will identify the bad apples, rather than the reflective discussion in the workplace. Now, one of our key responsibilities in implementing the legislation was that we had to standardise the process. This is what we've done in Scotland. It varies a little bit in the rest of the United Kingdom, but the principles are all the same, as I said. We've said that all appraisers must be trained to a uniform standard. We've asked National Education Scotland to do that, and all our appraisers must attend the courses run by NES. We said that all appraisers must be allocated to the appraisee, ending the cosy chat in the pub. And appraisers must take a minimum of 10 appraisals to ensure consistency of standard. And what that's done in Scotland is it's aligned appraisal in primary and secondary care. We actually had very robust appraisal in primary care over the last decade, so we've really brought that together. And we funded a number of activities, not least of was the electronic portfolio platform here called SOAR, the Scottish Online Appraisal Resource, again hosted by National Education Scotland. That has the facility to take in college and academic portfolios via specific ports. We've put an MSF on that electronic platform so all doctors in Scotland can access their MSF. We've had specific training for responsible officers and a responsible officers network, and we meet 3 to 4 times a year, again, in order to try and achieve consistency of standard. And as an example of our move towards remediation, colleges in Scotland provided a link for responsible officers just last week, which we circulated from the Scottish colleges. Finally, we randomised doctors in Scotland, so revalidation only began in Scotland in the 1st of April, and the first tranche of doctors in the first year will be the first 20% based on the penultimate digit of your GMC number, 4 and 6, and then the second and third tranches will revalidate in the years thereafter. So that was the mechanism we used. And as we know, the process has started. A quarter of that first 20% have now been recommended to the GMC. Before we started, Health Improvement Scotland undertook an assessment that we were ready, confirmed that our ROs, appraisers were trained, that the structures in the boards were there. They had a feedback and we visited boards. Then we reported readiness to the GMC along with the other home nations. And then we issued a chief executive letter to the boards to tell them that it was now time to start, and that they've done that. So that gives you an idea of the role the government had in the process. So just to conclude, what's next for Scottish Government then? Well, we'll continue to work closely with the GMC. We meet with the GMC 4 times a year, and with the other UK departments, to assess how it's going and to ensure that it's robust. We need to make sure, first of all, that the process is robust and the process around the boards. And Health Improvement Scotland will undertake an assessment this summer of how that's progressing. But I think we are particularly concerned to ensure that the appraisal process is consistent. And maybe we'll tease this out. Because we haven't defined very closely the supporting information that doctors are required to bring, deliberately so, but we need to ensure that appraisal is consistent. And from the Scottish perspective, from the government perspective, and I know this applies to all the 4 governments, we'd like to see evidence that enhanced appraisal and the money we've put into this, which is substantial, actually improves patient care and measurably improves patient care. So finally, just what now? Well, the first thing is we now have evidence already from the first round of appraisals that there are hawks and doves in appraisers. And the question is, does that matter? Does it make any difference? How much supporting information is enough? If the appraisers are variable, and we haven't defined the appraisal material, how much is enough? And I know our other speakers are going to deal with this. So should that be more directed? Should you be free to bring any of the information you want? And finally, how do we unequivocally improve patient care? In Scotland, for example, well, just before I come to this example, there's not a month goes by I don't get a call from some group saying, can we add this to revalidation? Attendance at fire lectures, could we make that mandatory for revalidation? Completion of ticking off that you've read the consent process, can we make that mandatory for revalidation? So there are lots of groups out there who would like to tag a great deal on to the revalidation process. And to date, we've said, no, JMC have defined what is required, and that's enough. But I think Scottish Government, we might like to see people bring a more focused portfolio of smaller number of items per annum, but maybe they'd be targeted. And we have a very active Scottish patient safety programme, which we're very proud of, and maybe we would like to see doctors being required to bring one item of that to appraisal, as an example. But I just throw down the gauntlet a bit on that for the future, because we don't envisage anything changing in the next 3 to 4 years while this is all embedded and we get it running. Thank you very much.